So, you want to own Damage Control, a construction and cleanup firm that shows up after every single superhero battle in New York and starts billing before the dust has settled. Most people watching the news assume the real money in a world like this is being a hero. Fly around, save the city, sell the merchandise. That is not where the money is. The heroes do not send an invoice. Damage Control does. Every collapsed building, every crater in the street, every alien battleship wedged into an office tower becomes a line item on somebody's desk, and there is exactly one company licensed to write that line item up. So, before you buy in, let us find out what it actually costs to clean up after gods and monsters for a living, and why the most profitable business in a city full of superheroes was never the cape, it was the paperwork.
First, correct your picture. This is not a demolition crew with hard hats and a dumpster. Damage Control is a joined public-private venture, originally stood up by the federal government and a handful of major corporations specifically to handle destruction that ordinary insurance, ordinary contractors, and ordinary law enforcement were never built for. Alien technology, unstable energy signatures, structural collapse caused by forces physics cannot fully explain. A normal construction company cannot legally or safely touch any of that. Damage Control can, because it holds the one credential that matters in this specific market: federal clearance to handle exotic material. Understand what you are buying. Not a repair company. A licensed monopoly on the only kind of disaster this world now produces on a weekly basis.
Now, the origin, because it explains the entire business model. The firm was chartered in the direct aftermath of the Battle of New York, when an alien army tore through Midtown and left behind a level of destruction no city government, no insurer, and no ordinary contractor had a category for. Someone had to clear the wreckage, someone had to account for tax dollars spent doing it, and someone had to make sure exotic alien hardware did not simply walk off a construction site into the wrong hands. A single agency was created to do all three, which meant it never had to compete for the work. It was the work, by charter, from day one. Every other company that might have wanted this business arrived to find the market already closed.
And we have a genuine real-world price tag for a disaster on this scale, because insurers have already had to model it. The September 11th terror attacks caused roughly $60 billion in real, insured and uninsured property losses across a single city block of Manhattan. An alien army tearing through Midtown for a full day, leveling entire blocks and grounding an active air battle overhead, is a materially larger event on every axis: structural, spatial, and duration. Scale that real-world benchmark upward, and a founding event price tag comfortably north of that $60 billion figure is not dramatic license. It is the conservative estimate, and it is why a government moved to charter a single dedicated agency within weeks, rather than let ordinary insurers and contractors work it out themselves over years.
Start with how often this actually happens, because the frequency is the entire business case. New York alone experiences a major city-disrupting superhuman incident roughly every few months, sometimes closer together, and each one generates real-world equivalent property destruction in the tens to hundreds of millions of dollars. A single event on the scale of an alien invasion, drawing on real disaster cost benchmarks, can plausibly run past $10 billion, once you count structural damage, displaced businesses, and infrastructure. Multiply a handful of large events and a steady drumbeat of smaller ones across a single calendar year, and the addressable market for a firm with an exclusive federal contract to handle it is not a niche. It is one of the largest standing government contracts in the city, renewed automatically, because the alternative is nobody cleaning it up at all.
Here is how the money actually moves, and it is not subtle. Damage Control does not compete for the work, and it does not negotiate the price the way a normal contractor would. As the sole licensed handler of exotic damage sites, it operates closer to a cost-plus government contractor, billing for labor, materials, and specialized handling with a guaranteed margin layered on top, the exact model the aerospace and defense industry has used for decades on projects too specialized and too urgent to shop around. A cost-plus contract does not reward efficiency. It rewards scale, and it rewards being the only bidder in the room, which damage control always is, by design, because the charter that created it also made sure no competitor ever could.
Put a number on that structure, because cost-plus defense-style contracts are well understood on the real books. Firms operating this model typically lock in margins in the range of 10 to 15% over their actual costs, guaranteed, regardless of how efficiently or inefficiently the job is actually run. On a market generating hundreds of millions to billions in annual cleanup and reconstruction spend, even the low end of that range produces tens of millions of dollars in essentially risk-free profit a year. A normal construction firm eats the cost of a job that runs long. Damage control gets paid more the longer and more complicated the job becomes, because the contract is built to cover cost, not to punish it, and every hour of overtime on a crater full of alien wreckage is simply another billable line.
Which brings us to the real reveal. The rubble is not the business. The rubble is the receipt. What damage control actually sells is liability containment, the legal and financial machinery that decides who pays when a god fights a monster through somebody's apartment building. Every claim has to be assessed, every act classified as an act of war, an act of nature, or an act of a specific individual who can, in theory, be billed directly. And every one of those classifications determines whether an insurer, a government fund, or an unlucky superhero personally eats the cost. Damage control does not just clear debris, it decides, on paper, who owes for it, and there is no appeal process because there is no other agency qualified to disagree.
And there is a quieter product sitting on top of the liability work, which is reputation management. Damage control licenses its own name and mascot for merchandise, tours, and public exhibits, an actual real-world revenue stream for a firm whose core business is otherwise invisible bureaucracy. Branded merchandising for a mid-sized entertainment or public-facing property can plausibly add low millions a year in licensing income, small next to the contract itself, but valuable for an entirely different reason. A firm whose main business is deciding who owes billions for a battle needs the public to trust its judgment, and a friendly logo on a T-shirt does more for that trust, cheaply, than any amount of legal argument ever could.
Follow that logic into the insurance market, because this is where the real leverage sits. Ordinary property insurance in this world explicitly excludes superhuman incidents. The exact carve-out real insurers write into policies for war and terrorism, because no underwriter can price a risk this unbounded. That exclusion does not mean nobody pays. It means somebody has to build a parallel system to determine payment outside the normal insurance market entirely, and damage control's assessment is that system. A city that cannot insure against its own superheroes has in effect been forced to create a single point of judgment for every claim of this kind, and that single point of judgment gets paid every single time it makes a ruling, whichever way the ruling goes.
Now, the second product hiding inside the first. Every site damage control clears contains material nobody else is legally permitted to touch. Alien alloys, experimental energy cores, technology that a hostile actor would very much like to acquire before the government does. Which means the firm is not simply hauling rubble away. It is running chain of custody security on some of the most dangerous unclassified material on the planet.
a service that, in the real world, commands an enormous premium over ordinary demolition work. A competitor could, in theory, learn to pour concrete just as well. No competitor has the federal clearance, the vetted staff, or the legal authority to be trusted with a piece of alien hull plating. Which means the security layer alone is worth more than the entire visible construction business stacked on top of it.
Try to imagine a rival firm attempting to replicate this in a second city, because the attempt has real-world precedent in how specialized federal contracting actually works. Winning an equivalent charter would require years of security vetting, a capital outlay in the tens of millions before a single contract dollar arrives, and a government willing to split a monopoly it has no incentive to split. Real defense-adjacent markets show exactly this pattern. One or two cleared incumbent holding an entire category for decades, because the barrier is not skill, it is trust built over time with the one customer who matters. A competitor does not lose this market on price or quality. It loses before it starts, because the clock on trust cannot be paid to run faster.
Now flip to the other side of the ledger, because this business is not free to run either. Handling exotic, unstable, and potentially radioactive or energy-active material requires equipment no standard construction firm owns: containment suits, specialized sensors, shielded transport, and storage facilities built to a standard closer to a nuclear site than a demolition yard. That kind of specialized capital equipment, in real industrial terms, can run tens of millions of dollars to acquire and maintain before a single crew is paid to use it. A firm in this business is not simply competing on labor cost. It is carrying a permanent, expensive, highly specialized capital base that has almost no resale value to anyone outside this exact market, because nobody else is licensed to buy it from you.
And the labor is not cheap either, because the risk profile is not remotely comparable to ordinary construction. Crews working exotic material sites require hazard pay well above standard construction wages. Real-world hazard premiums for comparable high-risk cleanup work routinely run 30 to 50% above base rate. On top of wages, ensuring a workforce that handles unstable alien technology for a living is its own enormous line item, because no standard workers' compensation actuary has a clean model for this exposure. Combined, these input premiums can plausibly consume a third or more of the guaranteed margin before a single dollar reaches the bottom line. A firm operating in this space is paying a premium on almost every input at once: materials handling, equipment, insurance, and labor, which eats meaningfully into that guaranteed cost-plus margin before it ever reaches the bottom line.
Now put the whole thing together. A single major incident generates on the order of $10 billion in real destruction. Damage control's guaranteed cost-plus margin on that work runs roughly 10 to 15%. On one event alone, that is somewhere in the range of $1 to $1.5 billion in contractor margin, before counting the ongoing security and containment premium layered on top. Across a year, with several such incidents, plus a steady stream of smaller ones, the firm's guaranteed take is not a modest construction margin. It is closer to the economics of a wartime defense contractor, generating billions in near risk-free profit, precisely because there is no competitor and no negotiation, only a bill.
And unlike most monopolies, this one cannot even be regulated away easily, because the alternative to the monopoly is nobody being qualified to do the job at all. A government cannot simply threaten to open the contract to competitive bidding when there is exactly one firm with the clearance, the staff, and the equipment to handle the work safely. That single fact
is worth more to damage control's pricing power than any amount of lobbying, because leverage this total does not need to be defended, it only needs to exist, and every fresh disaster simply proves, again, that nobody else was ever going to be ready to take the call.
And that arithmetic sits on real people doing genuinely dangerous work. Crews are, by the nature of the job, first on the scene after events that have already killed and injured civilians, working amid unstable structures and active exotic hazards, long before an ordinary emergency crew would be cleared to enter. Occupational injury and long-term health monitoring costs in genuinely hazardous cleanup work, drawing on real-world precedent from disaster response and hazardous material sectors, run substantially higher than in standard construction, sometimes multiples higher across a career. The guaranteed margin sitting at the top of this business exists in no small part because someone lower down that org chart is walking directly into wreckage that just finished trying to kill a god.
Now, the question nobody in this arrangement wants asked directly. When damage control assesses a site and rules that the damage was caused by a specific individual, that individual, not a government fund, not an insurer, can in principle be held personally liable for real reconstruction costs running into the millions or billions. In practice, that liability almost never lands on the actual perpetrator or the actual hero, because both are either unreachable, judgment-proof, or shielded by exactly the kind of legal complexity damage control itself is paid to navigate, which means the assessment function, the single most powerful lever in this entire business, routinely produces a bill with nobody realistically able to pay it. And that unpaid bill does not disappear. It moves.
And there is a genuine real-world model for exactly this kind of unrecoverable liability, because federal disaster relief already runs this way. FEMA's National Flood Insurance Program has carried tens of billions of dollars in structural deficit, real, documented, ongoing, because premiums and recoveries were never designed to cover catastrophic-scale payouts in full. A shortfall of that kind does not sink the assessing agency. It simply becomes a standing federal liability, renewed and refinanced indefinitely, year after year, exactly the shape damage control's uncollected personal liability rulings would take at scale. The pattern is not unique to aliens and capes. It is the ordinary fate of any assessment system built to judge damage no single actor could ever actually afford to cause.
It moves on to the public. When a personal liability ruling cannot be collected, the cost is absorbed through public infrastructure funds, emergency federal appropriations, and ultimately taxpayers in the affected city, the same mechanism used for real declared disasters. Damage control gets paid its guaranteed margin regardless of who ultimately covers the underlying cost, which means the firm has functionally no incentive to make collection efficient, because an uncollectible bill and a collected one are worth exactly the same amount to the company writing the assessment. The single organization empowered to decide who is responsible for city-scale destruction has no financial stake whatsoever in that decision being enforceable, only in it being made.
So map the actual flaw sitting under this business, because a monopoly this total is not automatically a stable one. Every dollar of damage control's guaranteed margin depends on political will, a government renewing an exclusive charter year after year, event after event, without ever seriously entertaining a competitor or an in-house alternative. Political will is not a contract. It can shift after one sufficiently embarrassing scandal, one leaked memo about inflated billing, one high-profile case where an assessment looks less like science and more like convenience.
A business built entirely on being the only qualified vendor has no defensible market position the moment a government decides qualification can be redefined. And unlike a normal company, damage control cannot simply outcompete that decision. It can only lobby against it.
Price that fragility the way a competent analyst should. A firm this dependent on a single renewing government relationship, with no meaningful competitors and no alternative customer base, is carrying concentration risk that would terrify an investor in almost any other industry. Real defense contractors that concentrated this heavily on one customer have historically traded at a valuation discount of 20 to 30% against diversified peers, purely for that risk. There is no diversification play here, no expansion into a second market, because the entire value of the business is being the one licensed responder to a very specific, very narrow category of disaster in one metropolitan region. Comparable specialized contractors typically hold at least 2 or 3 government relationships as a floor against exactly this exposure. A defense contractor selling to one government at least sells hardware that has value elsewhere. Damage control's core asset, the license itself, has no value anywhere the charter does not apply, which makes the entire enterprise worth exactly as much as the next renewal, and not $1 more.
So, close the book. Per major incident, roughly $10 billion in destruction, and a guaranteed contractor margin in the range of $1 to $1.5 billion. Underneath that, tens of millions in specialized equipment, elevated hazard pay, and unmodelable insurance exposure, all absorbed before the guaranteed margin is even counted. The billing mechanism routinely produces claims against individuals who can never actually pay, quietly shifting the real cost onto public funds while the firm collects its margin regardless. And underwriting the entire arrangement, a single renewable government charter with 0 competitors and 0 diversification, worth everything while political will holds and worth nothing the instant it does not. That is the real shape of the business. Not a construction company, a government-granted monopoly on the aftermath of a war that never officially ends.
Convert it, and the scale is genuinely startling. A firm generating $1 billion or more in guaranteed margin per major incident across several incidents a year would sit comfortably among the largest specialized government contractors in the country, a valuation easily running into the tens of billions once you price in the exclusivity of the charter itself. Strip the charter's exclusivity out and apply a normal specialized contractor multiple instead, and that figure falls by more than half. But strip away the charter, the one asset that cannot be sold, transferred, or replicated by anyone else, and what remains is a modest, highly specialized construction and logistics firm with expensive equipment and no obvious customer. On paper, well over 90% of that valuation traces back to one intangible line, the charter itself. The entire value of damage control is not the buildings it repairs, the crews it employs, or the technology it recovers. It is a single piece of paper granting exclusive access to disasters that have not happened yet, and that piece of paper is worth more than everything else on the balance sheet combined.
So, should you buy damage control? On the numbers, it is one of the most quietly profitable businesses in this entire city, a guaranteed margin on a market that renews itself every time 2 powerful beings disagree in public. But the thing actually generating that value was never the concrete, the cranes, or the crews in containment suits. It is a monopoly granted by decision, not earned by competition, sitting on top of a billing system where the people actually responsible almost never pay, and the public almost always does. The lesson underneath this business is not really about aliens or capes or craters in Manhattan.
It is that in any system chaotic enough, someone always gets appointed to write the official account of what happened and who owes for it, and that position, quietly, without ever throwing a punch, is worth more than every superpower in the fight combined.